Hello. This is such a great panel, especially just coming right off of that little promo for Lyft and Co. Expo with the Business Day Summit. Not to really plug it away, but that's what the topic today is about, is how to get into the psychedelic space. And I'm really so excited that you're all here to talk about it. So as we get started, we could go to Ivy and Janet, and we'll just wait for Alison. I think Alison's coming on. We'll do some introductions. And so Ivy, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Ivy Astrix. I was formerly the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Tantalus Labs, and now doing some both cannabis and psychedelic consulting, regulatory-wise, and a couple other areas with my company, Astrix Consulting. And quite famously, broke into the cannabis industry via a couple tweets and a couple DMs. So I'm eager to share some of those insights here today.
Great. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us. Anne, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I have problems with the mute button. That's the first thing everybody should know about me.
That's great. Just keep talking. We don't want you muted at all.
On the panel, honestly. So my background is I'm a corporate lawyer, got disgruntled, quit, started a couple of health food companies, started a hemp seed company, hemp food company, and a chia company that morphed into a superfood company. Then I got really interested into, wrote a couple of cookbooks, vegan, gluten-free, and then got really interested in the hemp growing aspect, which then led me to cannabis. And then I started the first Canadian licensed producer company for legally growing and producing cannabis, which was Peace Naturals, which I then sold to a company called Kronos. And in the meantime, while I was doing all that, I was basically going through my own personal issues of menopause and couldn't find any natural ways to cure that. So I basically went out and formulated it myself, and then started my plant-based company, which is basically supplements to help with like anti-aging and for basically issues that have sort of been ignored for a lot of us females. So that's what I was doing. And also I'm a director of Red Light Holland, which is a psychedelic company that legally sells microdose packs in the Netherlands and is doing research around the world.
Welcome. What an incredible journey. Thank you so much. Between you and Ivy, just all the movement. And I'm going to pass it over to Janet, and then welcome Alison after Janet does her introduction. Okay.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Janet Chi. I'm a corporate banker turned psychedelic industry practitioner. And I've co-founded a company called Pure Minds Biopharma. We're a drug development company in the psychedelic space, looking for breakthrough and cures and solutions for devastating psychiatric and neurological diseases. And at the same time, and before that, I also founded a company that is in the space of extraction, especially and focusing on green extraction and organic nano emulsion, which is something that I've never done before, but I'm the kind of person and trying to break into new fields all the time. So that's me.
Oh, great. Well, welcome. Really, Ivy and you, all of this background of these pivots in and out, I think it's perfect to turn it over to Alison with all of your HR experience. Alison, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about you?
Hey, sorry for being late. I was clicking on the wrong links apparently, but happy to be here.
We're happy you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. So I'm the CEO and founder of Cannabis at Work. We are a recruitment agency focused exclusively on the cannabis sector until now, obviously looking closely at the psychedelics world in addition. So from my vantage point, I guess I broke into the cannabis sector in terms of starting Cannabis at Work and having an ancillary business in this space, but also with the work we do, we've helped countless people break into the cannabis sector. And I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of a lot of the roles that we're seeing in the psychedelic space, and continue to yeah, try to bring talent into these emerging sectors.
Great. Well, you definitely are. And I'm Bridget Hoffer. I'm the co-founder of Marigold PR, and delighted to be hosting this event today with my business partner, Katie Pringle, and our team. My background is in media and broadcast and digital. So I have a lot of experience there and have been working in the cannabis space for the past 5 years, and now very excited to be in the psychedelic space. And that's what the topic of this conversation is. It's about breaking into the psychedelic industry. And I think we've got an amazing group to talk about first entree points, ideas, advice, and tips. So I'm going to start off with you, Ivy, and I think it'd be fun to talk about some unorthodox entry points and social media. So psychedelics is a new industry. How do you describe the use of social media in the space when exploring these new opportunities? How can social media work to break into this space?
Sure. So, I mean, one thing I would begin with is that the regulated industry of psychedelics is quite new, but there's been a legacy industry, much like cannabis, that's been around for a while. And a lot of people in that industry have used social media, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, now Clubhouse, to kind of network and to kind of test business models and to see what kind of feedback they get. So it really depends like what your context is. So if you're coming from the regulated space, you have more restrictions placed on you in terms of that versus if you're just trying to do something like a non-primary psychedelics venture. So that might be psychedelic coaching or a lot of the psychedelic content that we're seeing now. If you come from the regulated side, those restrictions that I talked about are like actually not the ones that are mandated by governments. There's a very tenuous landscape right now with social media, even for cannabis in Canada. Like we've seen retailers, licensed producers have their Instagram accounts yanked with no warning. And like it's probably the only industry where you can be completely illegal at the federal level and also constantly be at risk of like having one of your major sales funnels and marketing tools pulled out from under you and just having to kind of deal with it. But like in terms of breaking into the industry, if you're a new regulated company, I would say that you should have a very well-defined marketing strategy, brand presence, and just basically sign on for that risk. With some of the newer social platforms like Clubhouse, it's actually a really good environment right now because that does not have the kind of heavy attention on it, and it is audio only. But if you can work that into your marketing strategy, you are at far less risk of being suspended on Clubhouse, given there's a whole club called Psychedelic Clubhouse with a lot of really cool talks by a lot of big names in psychedelics like Rick Doblin, Dr. Molly Maloof, and a whole bunch of other people. Now, if you're going at it from more of a non-primary side, I would say just kind of cultivate your personal brand, just like the general social media strategies, and see what niches that are not currently being serviced, because it's one thing to play in a crowded kind of field, and if you're really good and your content's really sharp, then you'll probably rise to the top. But I mean, if not, if there are other niches which you can get into and be some of the first movers in, I would say that's a really good thing. And probably the last thing I would say is like, don't think any strategy or like any move is like too, within reason, it is too silly or like won't work. I got my job at Tantalus basically because Dan and I had been friends on Twitter for a couple of years, and I DM'd him one day quite boldly and said, "Hey Dan, I should probably come work for your cannabis company. I know a lot about regulations and I'm pretty good at cannabis stuff." So I mean, it's often those bold moves that will get you either first mover advantage or a position with a company if that's what you're looking for. But that would probably be my spiel on social media.
Okay, well, that's great advice. Thinking of bold moves, having a well-defined marketing strategy and brand, whether it's for your company or for yourself. I think those are really terrific tactics. But we also need to know the reasons why you should get into the cannabis, into the psychedelic space, sorry. And I'm going to turn it over to Janet right now and say, you know, many people are talking about psychedelics, financial opportunities, you're a former investment person, psychedelic renaissance, all kinds of medical breakthroughs in your biopharma. What are the right reasons when it comes to focus on setting your psychedelic business goals, Janet?
Thank you. So when I was drawn to this industry, I was drawn to the fact that it's so nascent, that there is so much potential, but at the same time, there are not a lot of data. And during the last few years, and I think when a business coming into the psychedelic business, one of the things people should really see is that, are you going to base your studies or your product development or drug development based on scientific data? You know, and then where the data will lead you and show, and where you can find your niche in this market that can really make a difference. And that's the first thing that I would suggest that you should look at, you know, and that's what we do. And also in order to accelerate the business goals of the industry, and there are so many unmet needs in the industry itself. For example, the analytical testing of psychedelics, and also the methodologies and method standards. These are things that has not been established yet. And these are all things that we can do to help to close the gap in the science and those lack of data of the claims. And so far, everything we see and a lot of the things we're seeing are very anecdotal. In order to get to the right drug development and right psychedelic use, we have to show proof and we have to show data. So I think that's where, you know, the first thing we look at when we set our business goals. And of course, if we don't take this scientific rigor, you know, and there is a greater chance for more and, you know, defensive behavior from the government, from the public, from educators, and from everywhere in the market, in the society, that can have a negative view, and especially because of psychedelics had so much of a negative stigma in the society for so many years. And in order to break that stigma, we have to show the proof. We have to show a scientific methodology that is really accepted in the scientific world, and that's where, you know, we can really avoid, you know, another drug on wars like the LSD in the 1970s, and to, you know, avoid anything to hinder the potential of psychedelics that can do so much good for the people, for the society.
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic answer. You know, it's always so important to stop and think, you know, facts, not opinions and perceptions, having those standard methodologies. It's a deep dive, but it's important because I think if there is some standardization, it will move the industry forward. And there's lots to learn in terms of the similarities between cannabis and the psychedelic industry. And I'm going to turn it over to Anne now. And what are some of the key similarities between the cannabis and psychedelic industries that will leverage growth for business in the psychedelic space?
So I think that there's a lot of similarities, but I think there's a lot of differences. And I think the differences are where the money is, where the opportunities are, where the learning is, right? So, you know, if I look at cannabis as an industry, and again, I was really early on, so it's become a much nicer place now than it was when starting out. It was really a horrific number of years. Because again, we were fighting against the regulators, as Ivy's identifying. Like it was absolutely excruciating to go through that process, and they were making up the laws as they went along. So, you know, I would say that the cannabis industry kind of almost comes from a history of, like, it's a use-based industry where you use cannabis. It sort of like manages your issues. Whereas I see the psychedelic industry as being far more focused throughout the years on academic learning, on science, on real research, on multiple levels of research, looking at different components of how these psychedelic compounds can help us on different levels. So I think that, you know, cannabis didn't really have that focus on helping people. I think that, you know, my company was, because I actually give a shit, but
Yes, of
no,
course you
really, I mean,
do. No, you do.
my mom died in my arms at 21 of
Oh
cancer.
my
And
God.
I was going to do something on this planet to try to like do something to give back, you know, like these are
Yeah.
real things. And anyway, the point being, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anybody, but I'm saying that I think the motivation is very different. And I think that we can learn so much from those differences and the nuances. So I would say that the benefits of the psychedelic are that we're not as production focused. I think the whole cannabis market was very, and I'm putting my hand up on that one, production focused, how many plants you've got, look at how big my plants are, look at how many plants I got. Like that's ego stuff, right? Like that's really about the, you know, who, what, you know, who's smoking my weed and, you know, the endorsements and blah, 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 right? I think that that is actually, you know, the cannabis market is actually going to very quickly commoditize. So you're going to get into a commodity kind of play with like, with specific things that come out of that, so that you've got, you know, we haven't even talked about the terpenes, the flavonoids. There's so many things in that plant that we don't know. So the science really has to catch up with the plant itself. Whereas I think in psychedelics, the science is actually really nicely kind of like leading the charge. So I see that as a real benefit, especially I would say, you know, for entrepreneurial type of people. Like it really is a great opportunity because it's a much more, I think, inclusive community, and I think it's a much more kind of fact-based focused community, which I think is what everybody right now on the planet is looking for. So I see the opportunities as being quite huge.
Wow. So that's a really interesting take, the way you described it. You know, bit of a response, because when you think about deep science, fact-based, multiple testing methodologies, and then you know, a more use-based approach for cannabis, trying to balance that out. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions about that coming from the chat as we're talking. Thanks for that answer. Alison, from an HR perspective, what's it going to be like being a woman in psychedelics? What's this space going to be like?
It's a funny question. And I think I think it's going to be like what it's like to be a woman in every other space. I think that, you know, we continue to have some of the same kind of systemic challenges around inclusion. I know you just had a panel talking about, you know, some of the challenges around inclusion and diversity. But I think,
authority too, you know?
yeah, I mean, I think that the cannabis industry, in many ways, the kind of legacy market was a place where there were a lot of females producing products and very involved in those sectors. I think, as we all know, it's no secret that the commercial, legal, regulated market in Canada very much brought in the bankers and lawyers and changed that landscape quite a lot. But there's, I think, a real foundation in this industry. And I know Ivy and I've had some conversations about this before, and please feel free to chime in. But I just think just around how much inclusivity there is in this sector. I know for me, and this isn't so much a gender-based comment, but the cannabis industry has always been home. There's common ground for the people who are who were in this industry early, and I think the psychedelics sector will have that kind of same vibe to it in terms of people that are willing to step up and be part of this industry in its early stages. Creates common ground for all of us, and I think it's also this kind of a little bit of like the misfits of the world who are willing to step forward into these industries. So I expect it's going to be the same as being a female in the rest of life. But I think that there's some opportunity to continue to, you know, really focus on diversity in these sectors. Ivy, anything to add to that?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Alison. So I mean, there's like a lot I could say here, but I'll say that like psychedelics will be far more science-based, will fit into the pharma category far more. So I think like a lot of traction that we've had recently on women in, you know, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, will kind of help that a bit, because I definitely have to echo what you said, Alison. When the money came in, we saw a lot of the legacy market females, unfortunately, some of them not find places in the industry, and I'm really hoping that won't happen with psychedelics, given there are a little bit more guardrails, I think, in the big pharma landscape and the overall industry structure than perhaps there were in cannabis. And it should be, fingers crossed, should be less of a Wild West kind of scenario, which often leaves underrepresented populations out in the cold. So hopefully that will not happen here.
And I'd be curious if I could just kind of even throw it over to Anne. I mean, somebody who's been through the early stages of the cannabis sector and now doing the same in psychedelics, like if you see any differences.
I actually do. And I think that, because I've actually spent some time thinking about this, I think that the cannabis industry, because it was, illegal for such a long time, the people that were growing tended to, be growing, quote unquote, in the dark. Like it really created a reclusive, I'm in my basement, and listen, like these were my really good friends, and they actually ended up coming to work for Peace Naturals and were incredible growers. But when you talk to growers, like that's the industry that they come from, and it attracted like different elements, people looking for money. And I think that it wasn't the most conducive to a female-friendly, welcoming environment, because it started out almost having to be this underground type of, don't let anybody know that we're here type of thing. So I see the psychedelic industry as being a lot more kind of open and inclusive, especially because it has the mental health element that we now actually, I think, really can take that to our advantage and really be leaders in that. I think that we have that real opportunity. So I see the psychedelic industry as being more inclusive, just because it's on its foundation more conscious.
Okay, and Janet, do you have anything to add on that, coming from a corporate and investment background, like being a woman coming into the space? What Anne's saying is really, and Ivy are saying is really important in terms of looking at that focus on psychedelics and the the painful history of cannabis in some ways.
I would like to add, it's also from a different cultural background. I come from the Chinese background, and when cannabis was being pursued in the market, the Chinese community still thinks that cannabis is like it's a very unspoken for industry that people don't want to mention. And when I talk to people that say I'm actually in the extraction of cannabis, the people think that I'm a drug dealer. So, so in my space, so that, and I can see that when you're coming into the psychedelic business, you have more and more scientific people involved, and there are more scientific data that is floating around, and people are talking science, which is a totally different view. And I think I was hoping that cannabis can be also scientific as well. And if you look at all the cannabis world, only GW Pharma is the only company actually now that was able to actually patent and get a cannabis drug approved, through by an FDA, because the industry, was more focused on, recreational. I was hoping that it was more scientific too, but psychedelic, it really fits into, the view that I think that any type of plant medicine can do a lot of good if you really study it well into science.
Okay. So fabulous answers. I just want to go back to Ivy, and Ivy, what I was hoping you could touch on, because we've been talking a lot about women and the difference in the cannabis and psychedelic space. Why don't you touch a little bit on the differences between cannabis and psychedelic regulatory environments and their impact on breaking into the industry?
Yeah. So I was just going to mention this actually, because it dovetails quite well with what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I mentioned about cannabis, like not only fitting into the pharma model, it is directly tied to the regulatory environment. Like in Canada, even though our psychedelic legalization path is following a similar route to cannabis in terms of court cases and Section 56, and now that's becoming a little bit easier for people to do. Cannabis was always far more freeform because basically it's a agricultural commodity, as has been mentioned here, and there was a tendency to treat it like many things it was not, let's say, but that's a whole different panel. But to treat it in this pharma space, and when we saw the MMPR, I mean, I think it's clear if you look at the MMPR and things like applying for dealer's licenses, that the MMPR took the dealer's license process and put it and amplified it by about 200 times. Why? I'm not sure, but once again, that's a whole different panel. So I mean, regulatorily wise, there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of regulations that even now, we've come from the MMPR where you had to build a bank wrapped in a prison almost to grow cannabis, to where we are now with the Cannabis Act, where you don't need vaults anymore as long as it's a properly secured room. You can store cannabis there. So I think what impact does that have on breaking in terms of psychedelics? It is far more controlled. So for example, with myself, I mean, I was able to develop my expertise, partially by really reading regulations as they came out, doing journalism pieces and whatnot, and that translated to a job in regulatory affairs. Even within cannabis, though, that can depend on the company. Some companies will keep those separate in terms of licensing, regulatory, government relations, and some will kind of put at least the regulatory affairs in terms of cannabis regulations in with their QAP, which is more of the science-based. And I would say that for psychedelics, it's almost always that you will have one vertical within the company, or one person if it's a smaller company, who will both fulfill the kind of chief scientific duties as well as deal with regulations. One of my friends who was one of the co-founders of Haven was both their chief research officer and doing the Section 56 paperwork and all that regulatory work. So a long story short there is that you will probably have to have some kind of science background or be really good at telling a really good story to kind of work in the primary industry in that kind of role. But that's not to say there aren't opportunities outside of regulatory jobs in the primary industry, but just in terms of what my personal experience is and kind of what my expertise was, that's kind of a big difference. Beyond that, I think that the lighter load on psychedelic regulations, just compared to the Cannabis Act, will let people, I think, be a bit more fluid in their roles and possibly have more opportunities once they are at a primary industry company, because there's a thing in cannabis companies where you will have so many regulations to deal with that your job often dovetails into government relations and lobbying, and that just kind of meshes together naturally. Versus primary industry psychedelics companies, I think because there's perhaps a little bit less of that to do, that you can have more freedom within that company to kind of focus on other opportunities, whether it's research or that kind of thing. And probably the last thing I'll say on that does involve research. Within the cannabis industry, there's a research license class, which quite a few people know about. What a lot of people don't know is that there's some great opportunities for cannabis producers in that class. One that I had delivered for Tantalus was basically just noticing one day that in the regulations there was one line under research licenses that talked about giving cannabis to human trial subjects. So I did a bit of digging there, and that led to Tantalus getting one of Canada's first sensory testing licenses. And very, very long story short, within the cannabis product life cycle, if you want to test something for flavor or other things without quite dipping into clinical trials, you basically have to take it right to the end of the process. There's a little hack that some LPs use, which was that you would release a product you want to test only to the medical channel, and you would do it in such a way through your website that only people working could actually purchase it, and then they would just kind of test it that way. if you have a research license, I mean, you have to have a pretty good research protocol. But if you have one of these sensory testing licenses, you can actually take a product at like any point in the product life cycle. So for flour, that would be, you know, once it's properly cured. For like shatter or rosin or whatever else, that's really just after it's produced. And then you can do trials which don't dip into clinical trials quite, but you basically record observations, and it's much like other industries like CPG with like edible food products, where they'll have things like palatability, flavor, that kind of thing. So that maybe speaks a bit more to the flexibility and the kind of ways that cannabis didn't fit into the big pharma model. So I think in the psychedelic research area, you will need kind of hard science credentials, and probably Janet can actually speak to this a little bit. But it's a little bit I guess less easy to be creative in terms of not having certain backgrounds within psychedelics. Like it's just gonna be really hard, for example, just to get into a regulatory role or a role that is like directly touching science without, you know, probably at least a BSc. But the good side to that is that if you do have those, then there's actually, I think, more opportunities within the company, depending on like size and what their verticals are, because that's your like primary gatekeeping method. And like once you're past that, you kind of go back to the cannabis flexibility of like, you know, this is a new industry, so it doesn't have to look completely like pharma, and there could be a lot of cool things to do, but that science background is quite often something that will keep you out of certain areas in the psychedelic industry.
Okay, so I mean that's important, because when you talk about, you know, the CSO and also being the regulatory affairs person, and then also understanding the demands of deep research and the benefits of really knowing those research pathways, that's very important in terms of, you know, sort of the primary. But if we think about the ancillary path into, and I'm just going to come over to you for a second, and what are the opportunities that you see in the ancillary space beyond, you know, to break through?
So when I was talking before about the cannabis being production focused, like to me that I kind of go back to the gold rush. Like, you know, Levi's made their mark basically providing jeans and clothing for people that were out, you know, running around with their picks. So it's like the opportunity here is not just on, you know, for the cannabis, the production side, or from the psilocybin, even just this, I don't want to say just, I mean the science side. But I think there's great opportunities. And I'll just give you I think that, you know, the parties that were Lyft and Company, I think that they are a great example of like thinking outside the box. Like they literally thought of that. Let's get a conference together. Let's be the educators. Let's be that knowledge base. And they created a huge industry out of that. So I think that, you know, for people looking to get into the psychedelic industry, I think that you want to be the person looking at, you know, the opportunities that are the genes and the picks, not the gold rush itself. And, you know, just giving an example, like I just had a text message yesterday from a friend of mine saying, you know, my wife has suffering horrible migraines. Is there anything that you can recommend? Well, we know that psilocybin microdosing can help fix it. I think, again, I was just thinking, like when we were thinking about this panel, I was like, what a great opportunity for somebody that has suffered migraines their whole life, and they basically can become that advocate, that influencer, social media, tie that all together and basically be that educator for people. So I think that there's so many benefits of what psychedelics does, and how on so many levels that it can help. When you start digging behind that research and you start really looking at what's happening, there's really great opportunities for people to get into that space and really really make a really decent livelihood, I believe in it, but also by giving back plant knowledge that helps everybody.
Fantastic. Janet, we're talking about people, but what about transition industries? Like, you know, Anne's identified some opportunities for advocacy, influence, developing new ideas. What are some transitions that current businesses should be looking at right now? Oh, you're in.
First of all, I would agree with Anne. The picks and shovels strategy is always a winning strategy for any industries, and also for cannabis and psychedelics. And we can see that a lot of the scientific companies goes into AI and machine learning, and which is, going into the drug development. Those are other, businesses pivoting into the psychedelic business. And you can also, for example, you can have extraction companies and, pivoting into, psychedelics, and especially with the plant medicine extraction. And these are all ways of looking for your transferable asset and value that can be applicable for a psychedelic business. And I think there are a lot of ways of really opening up your peripheral vision for your business and find, thinking outside the box and find ways of fitting into this psychedelic business. And especially, psychedelic business is very much of a scientific and drug discovery and, product development. And there are a lot of things that are transferable across different industries. And also, as we as business leaders, being able to dare to learn about other businesses and dare to drink from the fire hose is a must. And otherwise, you really sometimes pigeonhole into something that could have lesser and lesser of opportunities. And when we look at business, we always look at the marginal value and marginal asset. If a marginal value for a business is dwindling or becoming smaller, you always want to enlarge it into something else that can create a larger marginal value. That's the way I look at it.
If I could just speak to that, I think that was a great point, Janet. And I'm seeing that, like, again, like, this is an opportunity to kind of like learn. So getting into the psychedelic space and being in the health and wellness space myself for so many years, I've just learned so much about mushrooms, and I'm learning about other mushrooms, functional mushrooms, and I'm taking that knowledge and I'm developing lines of supplements around that, which is, and again, I'm seeing Red Light Holland, and they've just gone out and bought a mushroom farm. And this is going to be I just read it yesterday, $555 billion industry on the functional mushroom side by 2028. So there's things that are coming out from this, that are really great opportunities as well. And I think Janet is perfectly right in saying, like, open up your mind and talk to other people and learn and put your ego aside, because drink from all the fire hoses.
Drink from all the fire hoses and, expand your peripheral vision too, right? Like, I think that's great. Alison, I'm going to turn back to you because, we've been talking about brands, personalities, companies, individuals, ancillary opportunities, increasing your business assets. What's the state of the psychedelic job market right now? And what do you forecast over the next 2 years, just based on what Anne said about 2028?
Yeah, so I think just building on really all the themes that we've already been talking about, and I'll just do a shout out to anybody who's been in the cannabis sector, who's looking at the psychedelics sector, and I think we're all pretty experienced at drinking from the fire hose. So I think that's one benefit there. Just a scan I was doing of some of the different psychedelic companies and roles, and again, it's really going to build on the themes that we've talked about here. A lot of science-based roles, like a lot of research roles, whether that's on the product side or more clinical trial side. Formulation, product development, data scientists, that regulatory affairs, quality assurance, compliance kind of angle. And then there's also kind of like the counseling and psychotherapist side of this as well. And kind of that clinical side in terms of people utilizing these products and that impact on them. And then also a lot of the standard kind of corporate functions, business development, human resources, finance roles. So I think that just echoing again, there's a lot of these kind of the science focus. I mean, I think we would all agree that this isn't a recreational market anytime soon. So I think a lot of those roles that we see in the cannabis recreational market aren't necessarily as applicable here. but I also think what's exciting to me is over the last 5-6 years, we've really developed a lot of talent within the cannabis sector, within this regulated environment that has so many similarities. And so I think that that's really going to benefit the psychedelics industry, is that we've got people who have, a strong foundation to transition into these roles. And then if just to build on that and this idea of breaking through, I think there's a lot of opportunity, because this is a nascent industry, to really think about where you could fit, even if it's maybe not a super traditional path. And I think, to like Anne's point earlier of like, what is your passion point? What is your connection point or advocacy point? And start to create content around that, start to interact with the industry around that, even if there's not a specific role for you today, or you don't have necessarily your own business today. I think that I personally found some success in that type of approach years ago. I always love Ivy's story of just like being friends with Dan on Twitter, and then eventually getting a role in the industry through those channels. I think that's all real, and it seems maybe kind of almost overly simple in some ways, but I really encourage people to think about those strategies as they look to enter the industry. So forecast, I mean, I think we just heard it, giant numbers in terms of billions of dollars, even on the functional mushroom side, which I'm personally really excited to see that that's kind of growing alongside of this other psychedelics conversation. So there will be job creation, and I think it's the psychedelics industry is a little bit different because it is so scientific. I think things might take a little bit longer in certain ways to like evolve, and for organizations to get to a point where they might be ramping up production, so to speak. So I think there'll be a lot of opportunities with kind of those startup organizations to get in, to grow alongside, but really exciting.
Really, really exciting and significant. So we've got about 5 minutes left. And so what I thought I'd do is just kind of give everyone maybe 30 seconds or, a minute just to leave your last thoughts after this extraordinary conversation. There's been so many ideas that to trap. I'm glad that we've recorded this. So I'm going to start with Ivy and then go to Anne, Janet, Alison, and then we'll wrap it up. So over to you, Ivy. What's your last word for our audience today on breaking into psychedelics?
Thanks, Bridget. So very, very quickly, just to piggyback on something Alison said, you're kind of seeing this hired through Twitter thing big time now in the whole Miami tech explosion, Silicon Valley Twitter, Miami Twitter, Austin Twitter. So like, I think just that word breaking through means like to bring your personality in full, like just because this is a very science-based field that, doesn't mean you have to be head down all the time and can't bring your unique perspective and personality. And like many times that is what gets you past the like HR firewall. No offense, Alison, but like we know the firewall is a thing. And just to make connections, network. I mean, a lot of what I did was like going to cannabis conferences when I was still working for TELUS, and and like finding your niche. I never thought live tweeting would be the way for me, but turns out it was. And I guess just to kind of break down any barriers you have in your mind, because I think even just in like general entrepreneurship, if you think, well, this is too easy, or well, no, like this will never work. I like have to do a resume. I like have to apply. I can't just hit up a friend I know. I would say to like not have any barriers in your mind and just take full advantage that as Rosie Mondin and others have said, that we're building the airplane while we're flying it, and take full advantage of that, because it won't be like that forever. And this is really the time to go like around, over, through any barriers which might otherwise hold you back.
Oh my God, so inspirational. Anne?
I would basically say pretty much the same thing. I think it's important, especially now, to be authentic. I think that if you are authentic and you work with a sense of purpose, meaning that you actually care about what you're doing, I think that comes out, and that's probably how, Ivy, it worked for you. Like that authenticity is what is what the draw is. And I think that if you can do that and be conscious and be aware that this is a great emerging industry, that there are huge opportunities, but it's only as huge as you make it, and it's only as limiting as you make it, as Ivy just said as well. So it really is checking your ego at the door and thinking about the greatness, and then reverse engineering it from there is what I would recommend.
Thanks, Anne. I love that. I love the reverse engineering notion of everything. Janet, your turn.
Sure. So I'd like to shout out to people who are like me, who are not having any scientific background and not being from the culture that is really, very familiar with psychedelics and cannabis, and also who is really from a more of a corporate background. Being able to study and learn the business and not afraid of drinking from the fire hose is very important, because when you are trying to break into the industry, you need to be talking their talk and being able to say the right things and not making mistakes. And that's number one thing. And I think the other thing is that, there are multiple ways of making friends and bugging people. And I would say, in my way of learning this business, I learned by bugging a lot of people, asking a lot of questions and making friends, multiple ways. And having friends in the industry is almost like a foot in the industry. So, and that's the way I broke into this industry. So hopefully this is helpful.
Absolutely. And I love the notion of bugging, and, that we're all kind of saying that as we've been talking as well, like, bursting through. Alison, what's your last piece of advice?
Yeah, and just layering on all the other comments, I think right now at this point in time, like in history, both because of the emerging psychedelic industry, but also like COVID and how this has forced us all to work differently, I think that people are more accessible than ever. And whereas before you might have had to travel to that conference to get in the same room as someone, that's not really the case right now. And, will there be a shift back, as the world reopens? I guess we don't know yet, but I think also kind of taking advantage of the fact that you have this kind of captive audience, you have access to people in a different way than we've ever had before, and then utilizing all these other strategies that we've talked about around authenticity, et cetera. I think that could be a really interesting approach.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a fabulous hour, and I think we're just wrapping up now. And it's been terrific. So thank you very much. And everyone's social handles are posted, and if anyone wants to reach out, they will. And I'm sure lots of people will be reaching out. And I hope that all of our panelists stay connected as well. So thank you very much.